There are certain immutable laws that are in operation, and just as immutable are the principles of political science. And if the people forget those laws and don't know how to restrain the power of government, then the government becomes worse than the necessary evil that it already is. It's crucial to understand in this context, philosophically, that words are the skin of thought. So I think and then I speak. Words then are the substance of conversation. Philosophy is antecedent to law. In other words, law is oriented toward a certain philosophy. We have philosophical conversations about communism. We have philosophical conversations about fascisms. So philosophy is all foundational to the type of law that's being exercised in any country. Law is therefore the skin of philosophical orientation. So we begin with philosophy and we end up translating it into law. Now the Founding Fathers, when they studied philosophy, they studied men like John Locke, who today is not taught in schools and universities. It's not taught even in law school. But John Locke is the philosophical foundation that the Founding Fathers studied in order to put together the principles of the Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, John Locke was the one who said life, liberty, and property, which was later translated by Thomas Jefferson and adopted by the Continental Congress as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So these principles are very important to understand that as the philosophy of a nation goes, so goes the nation. The person who most influences that which is acceptable political philosophy will ultimately control legislation. So our schools today are teaching all these different philosophers. We're even teaching communism, and we're teaching socialism, and we're teaching all these great philosophies in our colleges and schools, but we're not teaching the principles of John Locke. There is an order to this, because the political body who makes and defines the law legislates reality. Now let's stop here and look at this for a minute. What does that mean, legislates reality? Well, there's a truth. There's a truth in math that 2 and 2 is 4. And you'd be a fool to argue against it, because if you were to argue that 2 and 2 is 5, and you multiply that a bunch of times, you're going to end up error. Let's say you're a couple of degrees off when you're aiming for the moon. By the time you got there, the moon wouldn't be there because you'd be a couple of degrees off. So if a political body is passing laws not established on any kind of a solid foundation, on any kind of a philosophy of truth, then by the time we get several hundred years down from the original foundation, we don't know who we are anymore. We're lost. And we're wandering around wondering what happened. We don't know who we are. We're the lost principle. So the political body who makes and defines law legislates reality. And truth then is relative and arbitrary, and it's not really truth at all. And reality then becomes arbitrary and relative. And we lose our way, and we become lost in a system that the Bible refers to as Babylon. So who does get to determine the standard against which we measure sanity anyway? If we've got a legislative body that itself is not operating under philosophy of truth, then any standard of reality, any standard of sanity that it would come up with is an arbitrary standard of sanity. And if we're operating under a government like that, we're moving into a totalitarian fascist regime, not unlike that of Nazi Germany or ancient Rome before its fall. Who in America presently controls what is general acceptable political philosophy? Now the order here is debatable, so you can rearrange these any way you like. This is not absolute. But I would say parents have a lot to do with establishing a political philosophy or any kind of philosophy in their children. Popes, theologians, and priests. Well, do parents take the lead from them, or do they come up with these ideas on their own? Lawyers, politicians, lobbyists, and bureaucrats. I lump all these people together because they kind of run together. And they are in control, basically, of what America believes is philosophy, because they're the ones that are the most up front with their opinions and their ideas. These guys influence judges and law directly. School teachers and college professors, of course. Media, CNN, Fox, CBN, NBC, and newspapers. You read these things. Now, you may not know it, but it's subtle. But there's a philosophy coming across. And they don't say, well, this is our philosophy, but it's what's being presented then that is, in essence, established on a philosophy. What is acceptable? What is acceptable? Generally acceptable political philosophy? This is acceptable. It's not acceptable now to challenge the constitutionality of the health care bill. That's not an acceptable question. We're only having a conversation about what kind of a health care bill we're going to have. It's not an acceptable debate to challenge whether the government can bail out banks and nationalize GM. It's only acceptable conversation to talk about that they did it. But it's not acceptable conversation to talk about whether the Constitution allows it or not. So again, who's in control of the conversation here? And that's the media. I understand that in several of the town hall meetings around the country that they were packed with Obama supporters, and anyone that was a dissenter was not allowed into the room. This way the media could show the rest of the country, oh, what a great thing this is, look how many people support it. So there's a deception going on here, but what's really happening is a philosophy is penetrating our minds through the media. Corporations, merchants, and TV commercials, of course. Hollywood, sitcoms, and theater. All of these things have at their underlying base certain philosophies that we need to be aware of so that they don't penetrate the truth or the true philosophy of reality. And of course, peers, friends, and family members. What are political philosophies? Well, basically there's two. One is called individualism. Now, the state exists to serve the individual. In other words, the individual is the highest power in a society. It's the highest reason that a society exists. You know, societies exist to benefit the individual as opposed to the individual existing to serve the society. So this is individualism, and that's where the individual is the most important. Now, to the other extreme is statism. Statism means the individual exists to serve the state. Okay, so on one end of the spectrum, we have an individual acting, just leave me alone, I want to do it my way. Or you have on the other extreme, you have statism, which is the state has total power and we have to do whatever the state says. So all points in between I'll throw in there, because ultimately there's a pendulum that bounces back and forth or swings back and forth between the two, and history demonstrates this pendulum back and forth between totalitarianism and individualism. This political philosophy, and I've put this together on a scale to demonstrate, a lot of people think, well, left and right, you know, conservative and liberal, and then we got, you know, all their points in between, conservative, libertarian, communist, whatever. But the truth is there's really no government or total government. And on this picture I'm showing, on the right, we have zero government, which would be pure individualism, individual control, no law, natural liberty, and that's actually a state of anarchy. On the other side, we have statism, which is total control with supreme power, and ultimately this becomes a tyranny. And these are the different forms of government, but somewhere on the scale, all these governments operate. And so what we want to do tonight is figure out, what did the Founding Fathers have in mind? What was a political philosophy that they rested on to establish the American government, so that we begin to operate back in that place? Because I suggest they had a good idea. Now, I've provided a couple of Supreme Court cases just to demonstrate that I'm not making this up. I'm going to be using quotes from very valid sources. Statism, any form or structure of government which regiments the citizen and reduces him to ward of the state, so that the citizen becomes a subject of his own government and ceases to be a free citizen. Now this is the extreme of statism. Government power exercised by compulsion, force, conquest, or legislative usurpation. Usurpation being operating outside the scope and boundaries of law. In other words, arbitrary relativism. In other words, we want to pass a law that says you can't spit on the sidewalk. Or, you know, some other ridiculous law that's really intended nothing more than to extort finances or taxes from the citizen. Usurpation would be a violation of the law exercised by a government. Yes, the government can break the law. All power is concentrated in the rulers. So under the principle of statism, you have a totalitarian regime. Government of law, of men, rather than rule of law. What's the difference? What is law of men? Okay, there's a law. There's a natural law. There's a natural order of things. The law of nature and nature's God is what the founding fathers referred to it as. It's also been mentioned to be the natural law. We could call it the law of God. There's a natural order in the universe. This natural order has inherent within it certain laws that you can't break. And if you do, inherent in breaking these laws is its own punishment. So a government of law of men means that we get together, we decide, well, we want to do this just cause. We want to rob from Peter to pay Paul just cause. We want to do this just cause. And there's no substance. We want to oppress. We want to operate willy-nilly because we find it to be necessary. That's what it is, necessary. Well, this is the rule of law of men rather than the rule of law. Rule of law can always be traced back to a self-evident truth, something, and that's what the founding fathers will get into.